Hello, welcome to the Entity Framework Community Stand-Up. We're back again with some more hopefully interesting stuff on Entity Framework. I'm here with two members of the team. We have Jeremy and Shay this week, maybe some other people in the background. Shay is going to present the majority of this with some information and demos on Collation, for which I'm going to hopefully learn some stuff as well. And before we get started, we have, or as we get started, we have a slightly new section that we're trying out this week that we're calling State of the Uni Unicorn. That's right, State of the Unicorn. Right. Cheesy, I know, but that's who we are. So this is, I'm not sure if people are aware, but I send out a weekly update, at least when I'm working, every week about Entity Framework, which goes to people inside Microsoft like my managers, but we also post it onto a pinned issue on GitHub, and we tweet about it. And this State of the Unicorn is kind of bringing that to the community stand-up. That's the idea, to just give you an idea of what the current releases are, what we're working on, what to look out for, things that are relevant today. The first of these is Jeremy has put together with the team a very complete survey for what you want out of Entity Framework Core. And this is an important part of our planning into EF Core 6.0 and beyond. There's lots of ways you can get to this survey. What I'm going to show here, and it's managed to open in my Streamyard view again, but we'll deal with that, is just a link to .NET EF Core. So this is .NET EF Core on GitHub. And if you click on issues here, we have 3 pinned issues at the top. The first one is the status updates that I'll come back to in a minute. The second one is for this show. So if you have ideas for community stand-up, for guests, for demos, anything you want to see on here, then come here and comment on that. And the third one is a link to the survey. So if you know how to find us on GitHub, go to issues. Then we have a link here which takes you right through to the survey and send that to us. I don't know, Jeremy, do you want to say anything else about that?
No, just super excited to get feedback. A lot of people have already responded. We tried to keep the survey short, but there's a lot to Entity Framework, and so we have a lot of questions to ask. Nothing's required. Feel free to skip over what you want. But the team is very committed. The team spent a lot of time thoughtfully producing the questions in the survey and are very serious about taking that feedback to input into our 6.0 planning. So we appreciate everyone's time and attention to that.
Indeed, yes. And I think I said something on Twitter along the lines of, don't just assume that what other people want out of EF is what you want. There's one of the challenges we have is there's so many features that people want, and there's a lot of variety there. So make sure your voice is heard about what you think is important. Okay, so what's going on now? Well, hopefully you already know EF Core 5.0 RC2 is on NuGet. I'm not going to click the link because it'll switch my windows around again. But it's there. GA RTM is going to be out at .NET Conf, which starts on November 9th. So that week you should see the RTM. We've been feature complete since RC1. So RC2 basically just has bug fixes and some tweaks to improve based on your feedback. But get RC2 now and use it. It's go live license. It's feature complete, and let us know, if anything breaks or what you like, what you don't like. The current work that we're doing is basically docs. So we're attempting to get everything all the new features of EF Core 5.0 documented by the release date, which I think we're making good progress on. And I'm going to point to some of those links in a second. The other thing we're doing is what in Microsoft parlance we call MQ, which stands for milestone for quality or something along those lines. What this basically means is we're doing all those internal quality things, code cleanups, additional testing that, where we need more coverage. But also it's not completely internal. For example, we're reviewing all of our exception messages because exception messages being clear and containing the information you want is very important. So we're doing that, which is something that tends to get pushed down the priority when you're really pushing to get a release out. So as I said at the beginning, all of this is this idea of giving updates on what we're working on comes from the weekly updates. And if I go back to my Edge here again, like I said, go to .NET EF Core, go to Issues. There's a pinned issue at the top for the weekly updates. The top part of it is basically general information about, you can link to find out all of the issues that we fixed in different releases, including the LTS releases. And then you can jump to the latest update, which will take you to the one from last week. And here we have the similar information to what I've been talking about. And then often some other more detailed information. So in this case, I've linked here to a lot of these documents that we're working on. So some of them that you may have seen already, for example, is we have this awesome Blazor documentation that Jeremy and the Blazor team and Shay worked on. So take that out, look at that if you're using Blazor with EF Core. But then we have, now documentation for how to configure many-to-many, how to configure TPT, those kinds of documentation. So take a look at some of this, and it will give you an idea of what's in EF Core 5 and how to use all that stuff. So I think that's the end of the state of the Unicorn. Let us know what other kinds of things you want to hear on that. And now let's talk about some links from this week. Let me refresh this because I think there's a new one. So feel free to let me rearrange my monitors quickly. Forgive me, so that I can see the StreamYard stuff again. So that was that one. Yes. So I'm going to put this back over here. I'll get better at this. And here we are. Now I can see the other guys. So Shay, do you want to talk about this a little bit? This is a post about using Azure Identity with Azure SQL. This is something that it's been challenging to know what the right thing to do is, when to cache, when not to cache, and Shay's been looking into that recently.
Yeah, and in like 2 words, when you use Azure SQL, then basically you have to do you pass an access token, one of the ways to authenticate, and those tokens are instead of your username and password. The thing is that you also have to change them. You have to rotate them. The thing with access tokens is that they expire after a certain amount of time, and the whole mechanics around managing that, how do you manage connections and change the access tokens as your application is running, is not a trivial thing. So here there's a nice section specifically about EF Core. This is about, in general, a library called Azure Identity, which kind of manages all that stuff for you. It also has a section specifically about how to do things in EF Core. This actually spawned quite a discussion behind the scenes, and this will be improved a little bit. So performance-wise, there's some things that this could do better, but it's still a very good blog post as it is. And if anybody is using access tokens on SQL Azure, definitely very, very good.
So one thing that this blog post is doing, and I think is part of the guidance that we give now, is to use an interceptor to do this. And one of the big advantages of doing that is that the interceptor runs in an async context. So if you need to get your Azure token through async IO, then you're not going to be doing blocking IO for that. So that's a big advantage of using an interceptor over, for example, trying to do it in on-configuring or some place like that where there's no async context.
Never do sync over async. Never ever do sync over async.
Agreed. Just another one from Shay. So there's a lot of Shay this week, which is great.
The first one wasn't from Shay. This one is really from Shay. Yeah, so this one is really more of a low-level thing. So I also maintain the NPG SQL System Data Driver, or ADO. So this is not EF Core. That's the really low-level thing that powers, that really talks to the database over the network. And along with EF Core 5 and .NET Core 5, or .NET 5, sorry, there's going to be an NPG SQL 5 as well. And one of the major features there are that we are implementing a big new support for cancellations and timeouts. That exploration, that whole subject, is much more complicated than it sounds. So what it basically means is that you can pass a cancellation token to a command, a DB command, and it will actually get respected. So you can actually cancel things in the middle. And what actually it does is quite complicated behind the scenes. So anybody who's interested in kind of like designy questions around what to do with cancellation, this could be an interesting thing for them.
Yep, it's definitely one of those things where it sounds easy initially, and then you realize it really is not easy at all.
Just cancel it. What could be so complicated?
Exactly. This was a great talk. Oh, I didn't realize it was going to start, so we'll just pause that. But this was a great thing with Jeremy and Scott Hanselman talking about EF Core. You want to mention it a little bit, Jeremy?
Sure. It was a fun, short introduction to EF Core. We showed using it with SQL Server and with Cosmos. It was great because I had some hiccups, forgetting to save. So we did some live troubleshooting, had some vulnerability exposed there. But I'll say the other thing, it's interesting case of forest for the trees. I was so excited to show off discriminators in Cosmos DB that different types are automatically tagged in containers that I didn't think of the overarching best practice of if you have blogs in Cosmos DB, your posts should probably just be contained in the blog. So there is a little bit of that, but we posted the updates to the comments. And for anyone interested in seeing what it looks like, those parallels between SQL Server and Azure Cosmos DB, definitely check that out.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. It was really good, despite the pain that Jeremy went through by not saving the file. There's a issue. So blog post here from Eric EJ. So one of the things that we've done recently is got together across the various ADO.NET drivers and said, hey, let me take a step back here and talk about connection timeouts and command timeouts. So this confuses a lot of people, myself included initially. ADO.NET has a connection timeout, and that's what typically you put in the connection string historically. And it's the timeout associated with opening and closing connections and things like that. There's also a thing called a command timeout, which was not previously possible to set in the connection string and had to be set by a property on DB command, a command timeout property. And that was a separate timeout for when you're executing that command, so separate to the one related to the connection. So what we've done is get together with Bradley Granger and Bryce and Shay and other people around the ecosystem who have ADO.NET providers and created a common way to now set the command timeout in the connection string, which stops you having to like get hold of your DB command and set it explicitly or go through an EF API to do it or whatever. And we wanted to make sure we try and do this consistently across ADO.NET providers. So Eric sent a PR for Microsoft Data SQL client for SQL Server. Many thanks, Eric, for this. So that's how we're getting that common feature in for SQL Server, and then it's already, I believe, in for SQLite. And Shay, is it in for MPG SQL as well?
Yes,
so this is one thing where I think we did the right thing here, and we're doing it in other things in ADO.NET where we try and involve the ecosystem and the community so that we get something that's consistent and not just only for SQL Server or only for SQLite. So many thanks to Eric for that. And we already talked about the survey. It's also on the blog here, so you can get to it through that if that's easier for you. Please do that. And then this is the documentation on collations and case sensitivity. You remember I was showing you links to the docs. This is one that Shay wrote quite a while ago now. Actually, it was originally written and then I think updated as we did more. So not going to go through this in detail. This is what Shay's going to talk about today. And so I guess unless there's any questions from the channel, let's move over to Shay.
Okay. So I've been wanting to do this kind of mini talk for a while. This is about a feature. Basically, we're talking about something called collations, which I'm sure most people aren't very aware of. But basically, let's talk about it in terms of case sensitivity and case insensitivity. So if you're comparing strings, are you using them with case or without case? I'll say two things about this before diving into code. This is all going to be about code. First, it's not like one of the large features being published, being released now with EF Core 5. This is not like a many-to-many thing, which is a huge splash or whatever. It's a minor thing. It's a small thing. The second thing I'm going to say about it is anybody who knows about collations probably regrets that they know about collations. Nobody is happy to have encountered collations or case sensitivity. It's like an infamous point of pain for everybody in the world. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, good for you. I really wish for you that you don't have to. However, this is a subject that programmers have to deal with a lot, unfortunately, because human languages are messy. They're not like computer languages, unfortunately. So I'm going to switch over to my code right away. Jeremy, if you can do the same. And let's start by looking at some code. So the whole thing is going to be around code. First, so this is a very small code sample. I'm going to go through this. It shows some very cool things coming in EF Core 5, so and in .NET 5 actually. So the first thing that you can see, which is kind of weird, I wonder how many people know about this. There is no program class and there's no static void main function here. So those of you who have been following C# 9, you guys are probably aware this is what's called top-level statements, a very cool feature coming in C# 9, like in a couple of weeks. Basically, instead of all the ceremony of having, if you want to do like a small program like what I'm doing here, there's no need for all that ceremony, the class with the program and all that kind of stuff. You can just write your program as it is at the top level. No namespace, no class, no method. I love it. It's perfect for samples. It's perfect for, demos, things like this. And it's perfect for little scripts. You can use C# in a kind of a scripty mindset all of a sudden, which is new in this kind of world. Anyway, that's top-level statements.
I love it, but I have to say it still looks super weird to me at the moment.
I'm sure it does. It's one of those things where, whenever something new comes along, it just looks super weird. And you have to have some time. I'm also struggling a little bit, I admit, and I'm an early adopter in general. Anyway, we have a blog context, all EF, there's a law in the team that all EF samples have to be about blogs and posts. You cannot deviate from this or you get fired, just so you know. So I'm in the clear, I'm doing things right. Basically, we create the context, we immediately delete and create the database. So every time I'm running this, it's going to recreate the database. That's going to be useful. We have a very simple, trivial kind of query. We're basically looking at our blogs. We're going to select and filter out all the blogs whose name is foo. Note the case, lowercase foo, very important today.
Shay, can you do us a favor? Are you able to zoom in a little bit for the font? We had a couple requests for that.
Is this better?
That's much better.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll keep it like this.
You could also, Shay, if you want, just quickly hide the solution. You can just click on the thing in Rider, right, and it'll auto hide it at the top.
That is true. Thank you. I am so ashamed by not having just done that now in front of millions of people.
There's somebody saying that this is a good feature for those coming from Perl, but that made me think about your comment about languages for humans being messier than programming languages. And I think that one might be the exception. Ooh, Perl bashing.
Because that's not true, because Perl is a human language as opposed to C#.
All right, I see, yes.
I'm just
okay.
I'm going to go on with my presentation now.
Yes.
Anyway, so we're basically just selecting these blogs whose name is foo, and we're counting them. We're going to output that to the console. Our blog context is pretty simple. So we have a DB set of blogs. We have our options builder. We configure SQL Server. Oh, there's a weird thing here. So that's going to allow me to talk about another cool 5.0 feature, this time in EF Core. So this is what we call simple logging. It's not yet documented, but it's soon going to be documented. So obviously, you've always been able to log from EF Core. Obviously, it's always been there, but it's been a little bit difficult. You had to do a lot of ceremony, and there's been some catches around it. So this is something that Arthur did in this release. Basically, a one-line thing. Just tell it log to console write line. Tell it, I want information level logging, you're done. So this is, again, incredibly useful for starting up when you're, when you want to do a sample or you're starting up some new project. You don't have to mess around with the, the dependency injection or anything else that's related to the logging. So very nice little feature that everybody can use to quickly get up to speed.
So I'm assuming you can pass that anything that takes a string, and it basically just says, when it's time to log, I'm going to call this.
Yeah,
correct.
So on the doc, I think an early version of the documentation is live, but the rest is written and just in PR, waiting for me to have time to clean it up and push it. But we show in that documentation, Jeremy, an example where we write to debug the debug output in Visual Studio, or we write to a file to get a quick login to a file. So it's pretty flexible. It's kind of the moral equivalent of the database.log from EF6, although it's it's more flexible and powerful in some ways, less flexible in other ways, but then that's okay because EF6 really didn't have any good logging, whereas EF Core has the Microsoft extensions logging, which is very powerful, integrates with Serolog or whatever you want to use. And really, I would say if you're doing logging in your application, it probably makes sense to set it up to go through that mechanism. And like Shay said, this is a very easy way without having to add NuGet package or anything to just quickly get logs.
The demo-friendly feature.
Exactly.
Yes. But
Just
it's not just demo friendly, right? It's a productivity thing like debug views or anything. It's like I'm debugging my app and I just need to get logs for this event that we don't even normally log, right? I can go in here and say, log me just this event so I can see what's happening. So yeah, it's definitely demo friendly, but not just for demos, I hope.
There's the same question about these top level statements. Is it just a demo feature or is it more? Time will tell.
Yeah.
Who knows? Anyway, I'm gonna go on a little bit. So if you notice, so in my on model creating, I'm gonna seed a single blog into our database. It has a name foo. Note once again, the foo here and the foo here are not the same foo. There's a case difference. We are gonna get to that very soon. And last but not least is our actual entity class with an ID and a name. And here's our third feature that's coming for EF5. So we did not introduce index support in EF Core 5 because it's been there. You've been able to create indexes for a while, and since forever. However, what we do have is you can now introduce them with attributes. So this is an attribute that we use on the blog to say, please create an index on name. Previously, you would have to go into your on-model creating and use the Fluent API to do this. Some people really love attributes instead, and that's fine. We want to help those people out too. So you now have this option as well. So our name field, which is the thing that we're going to be filtering on, now has an index, which is obviously kind of tells you what is coming, right? So I hope this sample is clear to everybody, and we can start actually talking about what happens here. So the question is, what's actually going to be the result of this statement, right? It's the most trivial program you can ever do. And the answer is, unfortunately, it depends. That's the answer that nobody likes to hear. So I actually literally cannot tell you exactly what's going to result here because the answer depends on which database you're using. It turns out that SQL Server is a case-insensitive database by default. So if I run this with SQL Server, let's just do that. I'm going to actually start running stuff. Hopefully nothing crashes. Okay, so you see our SQL coming out as expected, and we got one blog. And this is showing you that SQL Server, just like that by default, is case insensitive because these do not actually match completely. They're not an ordinal match. They only match in a case insensitive environment. However, if I switch this around and use the NPG SQL driver, which connects to my Postgres database, it's going to be the same thing running. I'm going to get 0 blogs. So this is already a non-ideal situation. Some people come to EF Core with an expectation that it's going to make the world, like whatever database you're on, the world is going to, behave the same and look the same. Some people expect us to kind of cover over all the differences between the databases. And as you can see, we don't do that. So we do that when it's possible, but we cannot coerce one database. For example, we cannot go to SQL Server and coerce it to always be case sensitive, right? That's not its natural behavior.
Well,
and
we could do that, but we don't want to do that because because it would basically cripple all SQL Server queries and make them incredibly slow.
Yes, exactly. It would do that. And besides, there's lots of people out there using existing, SQL Server databases and their porting programs, and their logic is case insensitive because that's what the default SQL Server is. So it doesn't make any sense for us to say, no, we've decided to make the world case sensitive or case insensitive for that matter. So we don't do that. And that's an important kind of thing. So now for the EF Core 5 feature, finally, because all this has been like just an introduction. So what if I do want to have a SQL Server, but I want my searches to be case sensitive? So there's a trick for this that we introduced for you. Let me just copy paste that for you. So this is the new stuff, right? If you look at this is EF Core 5. You can use this if you're on the RCs. This is a new thing where when I'm configuring my model, I'm telling EF that the collation to be used at the database level is this gibberish right here. You don't really have to understand this. It's a code. But the point here is that we're applying it to the database as a whole, to the entire database. What is happening here, so each database has its own naming schemes for these things called collations. We don't really care. The CS that you see here means case sensitive. The AS means accent sensitive. So it cares about accents and it cares about case, unlike the default collation, right? Let's run this program now, as is. Oh, of course I have a problem. I have a problem because I forgot to switch back to SQL Server, and that collation doesn't work for NPG SQL. My first demo bug in this session.
Yeah, but it's great to show that all databases are not alike, right? There's differences you have to be aware of.
That's true.
We should talk about, not necessarily, I don't want to interrupt the flow, but we should talk about why we can't make it something that we abstract out across databases.
Yeah.
I mean, do it now if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the obvious thing to do here is to have something that says use case insensitivity and have that not be tied to SQL Server and not be tied to Postgres. Whenever you do that, it just says, right, for whatever database I'm using, use the appropriate collation. It turns out that that's very problematic because the collations are different across all databases. There aren't really any standards at all. So you get something which kind of looks like it works the same across all databases until you get some special character which isn't treated the same, or some language which isn't treated the same, and then your behavior across your databases is different again. So rather than try and make an abstraction which we think will probably fail, because when you typically are doing this, you really care about what you're comparing. That's why you've bothered to do the collations and learn about it. So it actually becomes a very difficult problem to create a simple abstraction. We're not totally ruling that out in the future if we find common enough cases where there's common enough behavior among databases. Maybe we'll do something, but for right now, rather than try to create something that's going to be a pit of failure for people because they won't really understand what's going on, we're making it so that if you're using SQL Server, you choose what collation, and if you're using Postgres, you choose what collation. And if you have an application that uses both, then you can easily write conditional code that says on Postgres use this, on a SQL Server do that, but then you're making an explicit choice that you consider these things to be the same enough that they work for your application. So that's kind of what I meant.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example again of how we don't try to abstract away things and hide things in general at all cost. We can do that where it makes total sense, but we really try to avoid doing it when it doesn't. And I'm going to use this. I was thinking of talking about this a bit later, but what Arthur just said is a good segue into this. Collations again are not just about case sensitivity. So collations is an abstract concept which basically tells you how do I compare two strings, and also how do I order them, like in what order do I sort them. There's very weird things there. So there's case sensitivity, of course. There's also accent sensitivity. So anybody coming from non-English languages, basically, as usual, you have the same letter but you have some squiggly over it. Should that be taken into account when you are comparing letters? The answer is, it depends. Once again, that the answer nobody likes. In some applications and contexts, you definitely want it to matter. In others, you don't want it to matter. So that's a choice that you have to make as a developer for each and every part of your application, by the way. And one favorite story of mine, I can't resist. I mean, I have to tell this. Like, I don't know, 10 years ago or whatever, even more, I was working in Paris for this on the deployment of this large website, pan-European, lots of localization. And it went well. Everything was cool. And then we get this phone call from Turkey. People maybe already know what I'm going to talk about, because I think Turkish is a little bit famous in this field of collations. Basically, it turns out that in Turkish, this is not the uppercase version of this. They actually, in Turkish, you actually do have two I's. One has a dot at the top, and another one does not have the dot, and they're pronounced differently. And the uppercase version of this looks like this, but it actually has a dot over the uppercase thing there, right? So that's pretty crazy. And what it shows is that the whole concept of saying just do a case insensitive comparison doesn't mean anything. In fact, you have to know which language you're in or which collation you're in, to be more precise, in order to even talk about these things, right? So yes. Yeah, human languages.
We should do another one of
Anyway.
these on date times, and then we can have all kinds of other stories
Oh
as well.
no, please no, please no.
But
That's
we'll
the
try and
bane
get
of
John
my
Skeeton on
existence.
it.
Actually, that's a great idea, and there's a whole database aspect to date times and
Yes.
mismatches.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to move on now
Yes.
because anyway, so I'm going to run this again. We've defined the collation at the database level, and all of a sudden we have a Postgres result here, although we're running on SQL Server, right? So we've configured the database to be case sensitive now, which is weird. This is the opposite of what SQL Server usually does. I'm going to scroll up here a little bit, and all this logging stuff that you see, and you see that now we have this create database here that we did, that E, of course, sent for us, to be precise. And all of a sudden, there's a clause on create database that tells it to just add the collation. That's all it is, basically, is to tell SQL Server up front, please use a case sensitive collation or whatever collation you want to do. So you already you can walk away from this show now, and you already know how to make a database like SQL Server be case sensitive all around.
So I have a question on that, Shay, because that implies, though, that you actually need to change the database in order to get EF to do a sensitive in this case, case sensitive comparison.
Absolutely. So did you really have to raise that question?
Yes, it's important.
So SQL Server actually does support modifying the database collation after the fact. So you can alter the collation. And in fact, if you have an existing database, you have everything, you have a model and you have a database, and you add this line, which I just added, and you create a migration, you're going to actually see us altering the database and changing the collation. However, that's something where I really, really recommend reading the SQL Server docs before you do it, because it has some tricks and complications. Obviously, you can understand that this thing has to go and change a lot of things in your existing database, right? It's not just a bit that you flip somewhere. It will impact indexes and things, as we will soon see. So if you want to change your database collation, be very wary and do this slowly. That's all I'm going to say about the subject.
And are we going to see that? Presumably later on, we'll see that you can actually change the collation in the query. Are you going to show that too?
Of course, okay. I am.
We'll come back to it then.
Of course, absolutely. So, but even before we talk about the query, a more common scenario is that maybe we have the database. I'm going to comment this out, and SQL Server is case sensitive, and that's fine. But we just have a column in there, or maybe some columns that we want to make case sensitive. So not all columns are created equal, and not all of them deserve the same collation, the same case sensitivity strategy. So we've also added that for you as well, and that can be easily done as follows. So what we're doing here, I hope this is familiar to anybody who has a bit of experience with EF Core. We basically take the entity, the blog, and we drill in. We go to configure a specific property on that blog, the name property. And on that property, this is the new stuff here, we tell it to use the same collation. So again, the same cryptic code, just applied to the column instead of the entire database. So this is much less invasive, right? You're not changing the whole database. You're just changing a single column to do things the way you want to do them. I'm going to run this. And so you see, we still have the same results. We're still doing case-sensitive comparisons. But if we scroll up, then now what's changed is not the create database, it's the create table. Probably, so this is a pretty niche kind of feature. I'm guessing not a lot of people knew that they could do this, but it turns out that in most databases, you have this clause here after the type of the column, which is text in this case. You can specify which collation it has. This is like a facet of the column. It sticks with the column, and it's going to affect any operation that you perform on the column. That's pretty important, right? And one thing, so we've been talking a lot about case sensitivity and everything. This also affects sorting. I mentioned this at some point. So collation also tells you where to put, so which character comes first. Like think about the phone book. How do you order the phone book? And now think about how you order the phone book with languages that have squigglies on them. Do the letters with the squigglies come before or after, or which squiggly comes before? Because there's multiple squigglies that can appear on a single letter. So this is all very complicated, and this is going to affect your order by clause. So if you order by the name, then that's going to actually determine the way that things come out of the database. That's super powerful when you think about it. So have a think in general about your text columns, what it is that you expect in terms of sorting and in terms of comparing, and that's what collation gets you to. Yeah. Now, the thing is, obviously, people have been doing text comparisons and things before we added this in EF Core, right? EF Core 5. So how do people usually get around this kind of stuff? What's the usual pattern for doing this? I'm going to switch us around back to Postgres for a second, which is, again, case sensitive by default. And let's say we now want to actually flip this and make a case insensitive kind of thing. So if I want to force the database to do a case insensitive thing and I don't have this nifty cool EF Core collation feature, the usual thing that we do is it's very simple. I'm just going to code it like this. Every developer has done this. You just go like this, right?
Yep.
I mean, I'm happy. I'm happy people are chuckling, but it actually is pretty. I mean, let's face it. If we're doing C#, like normal C#, this is not necessarily bad. It's fine. It could be fine. It could be bad. I don't know. So the thing is, so now I'm in Postgres. I'm going to do Control F5 here. I'm going to run this. And I can see that now we're case insensitive as we wanted. So again, Postgres by default is case sensitive, but we've just modified that in the query itself. And we've done that very easily. If you look at your SQL, what you now see is this thing. So EF Core translates this toLower, this .NET function, into a very similar function on the database side in Postgres called lower. And because we lowercase this, that becomes equal to that, and everything is fine. So why do we need all this fancy stuff? And this is where I'm going to go into a little bit of performance, and this is a very, very important point. So I'm going to switch here. I have a SQL Server kind of console. We're flipping back between Postgres and SQL Server, which is basically the story of my life. That just summarized my entire life right there for the past, since I've joined Microsoft. If we look at this, so we have this query. I'm just going to run it just to, I need to select my database. Bug number 2 in my demo. So we're on SQL Server. We can see the result here. SQL Server has this feature where we can tell it to tell us how it's going to execute the query. This is an extremely important thing. This is maybe the most important thing I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So what I'm interested in is how SQL Server plans to execute my query. I'm going to turn this on, and then I'm going to run it. Instead of the actual response, I'm seeing this complicated looking thing. This is something that anybody who does database with a little bit of perf sensitivity should probably get familiar with in your specific database. All databases have some sort of feature for explaining to you how things work, how your queries are going to work. The crucial thing here is if we look at this query here, at the end of it, you see that we have something called an index seek. Whereas if I take the alternative version, what we see is a very small word has flipped around. It's amazing how you have to be attentive to details in this world. The difference in SQL Server between scan and seek is basically the difference between a website that works and a website that doesn't. Assuming your website is dealing with a lot of data, what this version basically is using the index that we've defined. Remember, with the cool new attribute from EF Core 5. So this uses that index, and this doesn't use that index. If you think about it for a second, that kind of makes sense because the index doesn't know about the lower. The lower is something that I integrated in my query, but the index has been prepared well in advance. If I'm just asking what is equal to foo, then we can just use that index and jump into the correct place in the index and so on and do everything that's needed to be done. But if I do this, because I'm filtering on the result of a function, we're obligated to go through the entire table, and we can't really use the index. So the word index is actually here, but what this actually means for people who know about SQL Server is that we're going to go through the entire table. I want to run the exact same thing, unless there's any comment from anybody.
There is a question. It's not directly related, but it's relevant to what we're talking about in general. Does Model Builder use collation just set or change the default collation for a database, or does it also change previously set up column collations? So what they're saying is if they manually applied one and then you changed it here, what's the effect going to be?
So I'm going to be very technical here. What this does is basically modify your create, the database SQL DDL statement when you create databases, and also it's going to cause alter database statements to be issued if you change your collation. What then happens in your database, so what the actual effect is on existing columns, is going to be database dependent. So different databases are going to behave a little bit differently around this question. And I'm unfortunately, I can't get into the the detailed specifics about this, and I don't even have them in my head right now. But I do recommend thinking about collation before you start a project, if at all possible, rather than leaving it for later and handling that later, because that could get tricky, especially in certain databases. Postgres, by the way, has somewhat limited support for collations. There's various things that you can't do with it, which for me is very sad because Postgres is the best database in the world. But in this specific instance, altering collations, for example, is something that's simply not supported whatsoever. So it's not going to work. So unfortunately, I don't have a single simple answer to that question.
It's probably safe to say that it's safer, if I can say that. It's probably safe to say that using on individual columns is a safer and more manageable choice. So you only have to figure out what it's going to do to that column, right?
I think that's a good piece of advice. Yes, yeah. I mean there are those scenarios where you just know I just want everything to be case sensitive,
if from the beginning you know that, then that's one thing. But if you've got an existing database and you're trying to migrate it, I think I would do it one column at a time, at least until I was sure what was going to happen.
So anybody thinking about these questions, I just recommend reading the docs. So SQL Server has specific docs on how to alter your collation and what that implies. Go through those docs, understand them, and then do that on pre-production before you do anything on live. That's all I can say. Okay, I wanted to show the exact same thing happening on Postgres, because that's going to bring me to another point. And also, I love this cross-database kind of thing in general. So this is a Postgres window that you see here. I'm not going to, So we're doing the same thing. In Postgres, instead of doing this set show plan on kind of thing, we just prefix with explain. So same thing, different way of doing it. So if I do this one, then I see something called a sequential scan. So you see that there's a query plan being outputted. It doesn't look at all like SQL Server because it's a different database, but the idea is the same. It's going to give us an idea of how our query is going to get executed. And then I'm going to go on the other one, which is going to be obviously much slower, and find that we actually have the same query plan. So what gives? So I must be lying to you, right? Because I just said that this version is really bad and it's not going to use your index. But if I do this, if I do this or I do this, there's practically no difference. We can see the filter, but we don't see any difference. So that brings me to a very important part of perf investigations. Never, ever do a perf investigation on a table with a single row in it, because it's meaningless. Databases are very, very intelligent beasts. And what they do is they plan their queries. So they're going to execute your query also based on the data that they find inside the table. What Postgres is doing here is it's looking here and it's saying, okay, yeah, sure, there's an index here that can speed up this kind of query, but it has only one row. I'm not going to bother with that index. I'm just going to do a sequential scan over the entire table, which is just one row. So this is not the way to actually investigate things. What you should be doing is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to parachute in this fragment here, which nobody needs to know about. I'm just going to say that in Postgres, this inserts 50,000 rows into this table, and I'm going to execute it right now. And that just happened in 653 milliseconds. And my table now has 50,000 rows and 50,001 rows. Now, if I start to do this, I'm going to end up with something very different. This thing now does an index-only scan, so it's using my index. But this thing here is still doing a sequential scan. So I hope this really should drive the point home. This query is going over 50,000 rows in your database. And 50,000 is not that much. It could go over 1 million if that's what you had. Whereas this one is going over a lot less. That's super important.
Question from me on this. I'm learning so much here. So when you did the showed the SQL Server cache plan, the query plan, is it not does it not then look at the amount of data in the rows? Is that something that only Postgres does, or is that just SQL Server displaying the information differently, or maybe just doing it in a different way?
So I know for a fact SQL Server is an intelligent database, and it does take into account the amount of data, but it doesn't necessarily do that in the same cases that Postgres does.
I
So
see.
you might need a different query shape to show this kind of difference in the amount of data of the table, but it absolutely does impact the
Right.
query plans.
Right.
Absolutely. And to answer your second question, what you see here is not some abstraction. It literally is what SQL Server is going to do. So it doesn't hide. It's not like behind this, it could be doing this thing or that
Right.
thing. It literally is telling you how it's going to execute your query. Very, very important.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent.
So regardless of collations, this is like the main takeaway from this. I hope everybody out there is kind of looking at the actual SQL coming out of EF Core or not EF Core, whatever it is that you're using. And those hot queries, so nobody cares about a query that you run twice at startup. But if you're running a query like every time somebody gets to your website and it's expensive or potentially expensive, you should probably be looking into it with this kind of tool. This is super important. It's super important.
So, I look at yeah, we're okay for time. What
pretty good.
What if I want to? What if I can't change my database, and therefore I can't do an alter column to set the collation on it? So I could, like you say, just do the lower, and I understand or upper, or it would basically work the same, and that would work, but not hit my index, which is a big problem. But what if I actually, rather than doing lower upper, I actually want to say, actually, I know the database has this particular collation. Use this collation, but don't, even though I can't change the database and I know it'll miss the index and so it will be slow, but I still want to use that specific collation rather than just lower upper. Can you show that?
Okay. Sure. So you're bringing me to the exact same thing, the next point that I have in my my mind.
I didn't know it was coming next. So
No. That's basically the
Great
question you
segue.
asked. Yeah, exactly. So thank you very much, Art, for that. That gives me the opportunity to. Anyway, so yeah, what Arthur is basically saying, what happens if I want to specify the specific collation that I want inside my query, right? I don't want to say too lower. I want to specify one of these cryptic things, but I want to do it at the level of my query. The reason you would want to do this, one of the reasons you would want to do this also is that it's possible you have one column in your database, but in different contexts, you want to do a case-sensitive or case-insensitive search on that column, right? You don't necessarily always use the same column in the same way. So it's fine.
I would imagine also if you have users with different locales, that you may want to sort for display in different ways, although maybe you would do that with on the view rather than directly in the database.
That is a great question, and it's tricky. I mean, it's tricky. There is, so if you, I'm going to get to it. Okay, remind me later.
Okay.
Give me like a few minutes. I'm going to get to it.
I keep interrupting you.
I promise. But I asked you to. That's fine.
Yes.
So I'm going to duplicate and show this basically the third and latest feature, the last feature, which is part of Collations. Instead of the two lower here, I'm going to replace this, and I'm going to use a new nifty thing. I'm going to use this new thing right here, and I'm going to take the cryptic code from down here and paste it here like that. Nice, right?
Very nice.
So what this does, you can think of it as an alternative to lower, because it really kind of is. Rather than applying a function to lower, this will cause, I'm going to just run this. Maybe let's go back to SQL Server because I don't want to get burned by this SQL Server specific collation again. I'm learning. So at this point, I get a weird query. Once again, this is stuff that you don't see a lot in SQL. You see select from everything is familiar here, nice and cozy. But then after our column here, we have this clause, which is super weird. And this thing, the collate and this code binds, if you will, to the column here and bubbles up so that this expression is going to actually use this collation, which is why, once again, we get 0 blocks out, because it's applying a case-sensitive collation. Now, a few notes about this. So this is very cool. But once again, like Arthur said, if I just do things like this, then I have the exact same problem as toLower. So I'm not going to be using my index. This is because the index I created was created with the column or database collation. So it's already created, it's already there. And what I'm specifying in my query simply doesn't match. So I can't use it. So you have to be very careful with this when you do it. You still might have to use it because, as I said, you might need to have, sometimes a case sensitive and sometimes a case insensitive match. But here's a really cool thing. It turns out that certain databases allow you to have multiple indexes on the same column. And certain databases also allow the collation to be specified on that index. So you can actually have one column with two indexes, each one for case sensitive and one for case insensitive. I actually didn't check this before doing so. The list of databases which support this, I don't have off the top of my head. If I remember correctly, that's Postgres and MySQL. And unfortunately not SQL Server, so you can't leverage this, but at least in theory, this would allow this feature to run super efficiently. As long as this thing happens to match an index that you do have on your column, that index is going to get selected, and therefore your query will be fast. So this actually can be used safely, but you have to understand what you're doing and also have the right database, unfortunately.
Now,
So
oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Jeremy.
No, I insist you. No, okay, I'll go. Will that work with anything like, for example, a contains is a common type of search, right? So would you be able to use a collation with a contains, or are the semantics
Absolutely.
of that? Okay.
Absolutely. So the nice thing about this is collation is something, logically, you kind of apply to your column, or more precisely to your expression. Then what you do with that column or expression, it doesn't matter. It's going to bubble up in even if that column is inside a lot of functions, and then at some point you have a starts with on what comes out of that. The collation, this is a bit advanced, bubbles up through that expression tree, and it's going to affect that starts with, because starts with is a textual thing, right? So it's going to be collation sensitive.
Got it.
The precise details, I mean, this gets sometimes a bit tricky, but it pretty much works the way you would expect it.
Yes. So
Cool.
What I was going to say is, going back to the point about you may be able to write this and have it hit index, presumably that would be a very good case to go and use the explain or the other query, whatever other query plan commands you have for your database, so that you can see when you do that you run those queries, it really is hitting those indexes like you think it is.
Exactly. So personally, so this is like me fantasizing. I would have loved a feature in my database where I can say, if queries don't use an index on this table, fail them. I would have loved to fail my queries eagerly, fail fast behavior on any sort of table scan, a full table scan. Some tables, if you're scanning the entire table, you've basically failed and your website is not going to work, right?
Yes.
So I would propose this, but I'm just a guy doing EF core and database drivers, so. But I think it makes sense because we don't have this. It's the charges on us. We're the ones tasked with looking at our queries, running them through these explain kind of things, and making sure that things are happening correctly.
I'm not a SQL Server expert by any means, but I wonder if it's possible in SQL Server to kind of create a view, or even just some computed columns for if you needed different collations, so you could effectively duplicate, the data and get indexes in that way. Maybe that's a way you can do a similar thing on SQL Server.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that could be a workaround. That's an interesting idea.
Yeah. Anyway,
worth checking.
So we had a question come in. I've been using EF functions like in my filter. Does this also cause the query to run sequentially and not hit the index?
Jeremy's made a big mistake here. He's forgotten a letter there. What is written there is not like, it's I like.
Yeah.
It's an okay mistake. I like is a Postgres specific construct. It's a very Postgres specific thing. It's exactly like, except it's insensitive. So It's a Postgres feature basically that says do this but do it insensitively. That's a great question. I'm not sure I have the answer. I would assume that if there's a collation, if there's an index there with a collation that's case insensitive, I would at least be able to leverage it. But whether it actually does, I have no idea. And the answer is that should be checked with explain. But it's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Do we have time for another small point, or?
I think so.
Yeah.
Maybe more Q&A? Up to you guys.
I don't know. Have we missed any questions that we should answer? Jeremy, do you know?
Let me scroll back through. Can you apply a new collation at runtime and change, for example, uppercase to lowercase?
So that's what we just showed that, I think. That would be using the collate. But you'll miss the index.
I didn't see anything else tied directly to collation that I may have missed. Feel free to post your questions if I overlooked it or if you have one that came up.
Okay. So this just gives me the opportunity, if we can go back to Visual Studio for a second, just to show one more thing and to give some insight on how we do things, how we make decisions.
Sure. I just want to say, are these features part of last release under NuGet? So this is part of RC2 that is available now.
They are. You can use this now. So there is one more thing I wanted to say. So the normal thing, if you want a case insensitive match in .NET, is this thing here. So in .NET, forget databases for a second. What you're supposed to do is you have a string, you call string equals, you give what you want to compare to, and then you use this enum string comparison to say, I want an ordinal but ignores case comparison. This is the idiomatic normal way to express this in C#. And we've received a lot of requests to allow that. We've received them, among other things, because this was allowed back in EF6 and people porting code had trouble, porting their code. But a deeper reason is that basically this is the way you would program this in C#. So why not let people just do this, in the database? And that's I'm going to get on my soapbox a bit. I love LINQ. LINQ is amazing, but it's a blessing and a curse at the same time. It's a blessing because it allows everything happens. You use the same constructs in C# to express things in the database. But it's a curse because it also creates this expectation that whatever you do in C#, we're going to be able to just do for you on the database. Unfortunately, in some cases, there's just a mismatch between these two worlds, right? Like relational databases and .NET are not the same thing. The reason we can't just translate it is, we've toyed around. People have talked about just translate this by putting two lower, right? This thing that we were talking about. Just do it because it would work. It would provide the correct result. And the answer is it would provide the correct result, but it would do that at a cost of not using the index, and again, creating a potentially disastrous perf situation. So then people ask, but you have to lower, right? Why do you translate this if it's so bad? And the answer for that is, when you're doing to lower, you're doing something very explicit. So you're applying a function, and there's a certain expectation that it kind of pops out at you. You're applying a function, and therefore there's a problem with index usage. If you know databases, then that's something that's supposed to tickle you in a way. Whereas if you look at this code, there's nothing about it that seems to even suggest that it could run in an inefficient way. And that's the crux of the matter. And this is maybe something that we talk about a lot with our users on GitHub. We try very hard to never make a simple, intuitive, basic C# construct translate in a way that's going to really mess up your performance. So we want the normal idiomatic code to be reasonable in terms of perf. Of course, it has to provide the correct results. That's the most important thing. But it should also provide reasonable perf. And this is something that a lot of people, it takes them some time to actually understand this kind of point. So it's fine if you opt into something which makes you not use an index. That's completely fine, and we're giving you all the tools to do that. But you have to do the opting in, and it has to be very, very clear in your code. When somebody else is reviewing your code, it has to kind of pop out. So that's a philosophical kind of point about how we design things that I wanted to get across.
Yeah, that ties back very, very nicely to what we were talking about right at the beginning, because I was bringing up the why don't we just completely abstract this out, and that's the API there that Shay showed, with the case insensitive comparison. That's exactly the API where doing it in an abstract way, as Shay just talked about, we think would not be helpful in the long run. It would not create a pit of success. It would create a pit of failure of people writing queries that didn't perform without them having an understanding of why. It's a difficult balance to make between the level of abstraction and where it's okay for it to be different on different databases, or where it's okay for us to do something, again, arguing that too lower, which I agree with, is explicit and the other one isn't, I think is a good argument. But obviously that depends on your perspective when you're reading those things. So another thing that kind of ties back to the simple logging at the beginning is that in places where it's not clear and we do something that you might, depending on your circumstance, find is bad for your performance, for example, we often will put a warning into the log for that. And so that's another good reason to look at the logs from your application and see if there's any of those warnings. If it turns out that you're perfectly fine with it, there's a mechanism to disable the warnings so you don't have to have them clutter your logs. But we try and put those warnings in there just so that if you're not aware that you're doing collate in a query and that's going to, destroy your index, and I'm not sure if we have a warning for that or not, but I think if we don't, it's from the backlog, then we at least try and give you that in your logs.
So if I remember correctly, if you do try to use this string compare with string comparison, we're going to throw an exception because it doesn't translate, but it's going to be a very explicit exception pointing you to our collations and case sensitivity page where you can read all about it.
Yeah.
So we try.
That's why exception message review that the team's been working hard on is so important too, because with good exceptions if you've used the old stack and you've got exceptions like the metadata at line 406 in EDMX doesn't have this thing that you've never heard of, then you'll understand bad exceptions very well.
So we had two questions that I think are related, probably for you, Shay. One of them is, how did you make the executed query show in the console?
That's basically the simple logging that we were discussing. So all I had to do was write this, add this to my context configuration, and because my log level is information, I get this information message, which is about every query that gets executed. It's that simple, one line.
Nice. And the second question is, when you're looking at perf, what is the tool you recommend for investigating queries? Like, how do you get the query plans?
That's obviously a very database-specific question. There's no answer in the abstract. Every database has some sort of explain or show query plan kind of thing. SQL Server, which I'm not an expert at, has a profiler. So you can actually see, you can connect to your SQL Server database and you can see the queries streaming in and you can see how they're doing, at least in terms of times. I don't know if it's easy to get the plan from there, but the tooling in general for SQL Server is really, really quite good. That's a very database specific question is all I can say.
I will say one more thing on that. In EF Core 5, we've also, in addition to simple logging, we have this thing called toQueryString, which is an API that you can call on a link query, and it will output a query which, as much as possible, it's like for SQL Server, like Shay says, this is very server specific. So for SQL Server, it outputs a query which defines the parameters and the query in a way that you can copy and paste into SQL Server Management Studio or your tool of choice, execute it, and then use that to get statistics on the query plan and all of those kinds of things. And that's also visible if you're just debugging your application. You can open up your link query and there's a debug view under there. And in there's we also have this query output you can copy and paste to SQL Server Management Studio.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question before we wrap the show, and I like this one because it's relevant to our release. TPH, TPT, TPC, async stream, views. Any news about them?
Yeah. So TPH has been in since V1. TPT we're introducing in EF Core 5. TPC is not in EF Core 5, but a lot of the infrastructure for TPT also applies for TPC, so it's being considered in our planning. If you really want TPC, be sure to go vote for the issue on GitHub so we know that's what you want. Personally, I would be disappointed if we don't do TPC because I feel that TPC often is a better strategy than TPT, while TPH is, I think, usually the default that you should go with, but that's very controversial. To me, TPC is usually the default you shouldn't go with, and you should either do TPH or TPC. That being said, we're not just driven by what I want; we're driven by what customers want. So we'll vote for it if you want it. Async streaming, I'm not really sure what that means, but iAsync enumerable has been in since .NET Core 3.0, I think, and we support it in EF Core 3.0 on, so it's in 3.1 and 5.0. Views, we have some additional support for views in 5.0 in that you can now map a query to a view and still do updates to the table, and that's super easy to do. You just need to do a to query and a to view or something like that. I can't remember the exact APIs. So we have that. Still, views is one of those things which is there's many things related to views that we could do. So that's another thing where go to GitHub. If there's stuff we're still not doing with views, go to GitHub and vote for those issues, because views and stored procs are things where there's lots of things we could do, and we're very much driven by what people want.
Very good. Well, I think that is going to make a wrap then. Shay, that was awesome. I learned so many things. My demos are going to get so much easier from now on.
My pleasure. It was awesome to be able to talk about these things.
I think the next one of these is going to be after we ship GA, and we're going to plan to do a bunch of stuff showing you good stuff in EF Core 5.0. So that one should be a lot of fun, and we'll try and find a few things that you might not have seen elsewhere as well.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.